I remember the taste of freedom, or what I believed was freedom then. It was metallic, like the recycled air of the transport that carried us away from the ash-choked hive world where I'd been born. My mother had whispered the Emperor's name as we fled, her fingers tracing the sign of the Aquila over my chest one final time before the alien ship's hold swallowed us whole. I was 14 standard years old, though the administratum had never officially recorded my birth. I was nothing, a number that was never counted. A soul the Imperium had already forgotten before I'd drawn my first breath in that polluted darkness. The Tau called it liberation. The commissar who executed my father called it treachery. I called it survival, though I wouldn't understand the true cost of that survival for years to come. The transport's interior was wrong in ways that made my stomach clench. Everything was too clean, too smooth, too precisely angled. The walls curved in geometries that seemed almost natural, organic, yet I knew they were manufactured, with a precision that would have made the mechanicus weep with envy or rage. Blue-gray polymer instead of rusted steel. Soft lighting that didn't flicker or buzz with the angry spirits of malfunctioning machinery. The other refugees huddled together in the cargo bay, families clutching what few possessions they'd managed to carry. The smell was human, at least sweat and fear, and unwashed bodies pressed too close together, but underneath it was something else, something antiseptic and alien that made the hairs on my neck stand rigid. I could hear the low thrum of the engines, nothing like the grinding roar of Imperial vessels. This sound was almost musical, a harmony of functioning systems that had never known the benediction of sacred oils or the prayers of tech priests. It was blasphemy made manifest, and we were all complicit in it. The watercast administrator who processed us spoke low Gothic with an accent that made every word sound like a question. She was tall and slight, her skin the color of ocean deep, her eyes too large and too far apart. No nose, just slits. When she smiled, it didn't reach those alien eyes. "You are safe now," she said, her voice modulated through a translation device that hung at her collar. "The Tauva welcomes all who seek the greater good. You will find purpose here, meaning, a place in the grand design." She handed each of us a data slate, the screen displaying text in both our language and the fluid script of the Tau. The document was called an integration compact. I couldn't read most of it. Then the scholar on our world had been burned out before I'd learned more than basic low Gothic. But I pressed my thumb to the screen where she indicated. The slate chirped softly. My identity was recorded in alien systems, catalogued and categorized in ways I couldn't comprehend. I had become data. The Imperium had never bothered to acknowledge my existence. The Tau had made me real with a single thumb press, and somehow that felt more violating than being forgotten. The quarantine period lasted 40 days and 40 nights, though I didn't know if the Tau measured time the same way we did. They kept us in a facility that was part medical center, part indoctrination complex, part prison. The walls were the same blue-gray polymer, decorated with propaganda displays showing humans and Tau working side by side, building impossible cities under foreign suns. The script above the images read, "Tauva, the greater good," in both languages. They examined us with machines that hummed and clicked, scanning our bodies for diseases, for genetic deviations, for signs of mutation or heresy. I learned later they were checking for warp taint, for the touch of chaos that the Imperium fears above all else. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. We'd fled one dogma only to be judged by another, albeit a dogma wrapped in the language of science and efficiency rather than faith and fire. The examinations were thorough and impersonal. Tau physicians worked alongside human auxiliaries, the latter wearing uniforms that were neither Imperial nor entirely xenos. They spoke a pidgin Gothic mixed with Tau words, their accents already shifting, adapting. One of them, a woman perhaps 10 years my senior, told me to breathe deeply while a scanner passed over my chest. "It doesn't hurt," she assured me. "Nothing here hurts unless it must. You'll see. This is better. This is the way forward." Her eyes held the fervor of a convert, bright and certain and terrifying in their conviction. I wondered what she'd left behind, what she'd had to forget to believe so completely. The scanner beeped and she nodded, making notes on a data slate. "Healthy," she announced. "Strong lungs despite the pollution damage. You'll be suitable for labor assignment, possibly technical training depending on aptitude scores. She said it like it was a gift. Like being catalogued and measured and assigned was somehow different when the Tau did it. The propaganda started immediately. Every morning we were gathered in a common area where hololithic displays showed us the wonders of the Tau Empire, cities of impossible beauty, tier upon tier of habitation rising toward clean skies. Factories where humans and Tau worked together, their movements synchronized in perfect efficiency, soldiers drilling in formation, fire warriors and human auxiliaries united in purpose. The narration spoke of harmony, of advancement, of casting off the shackles of superstition and ignorance. They never mentioned the Imperium directly, but the implications were clear. Everything we'd known was a lie. Everything we'd been taught was poison. The Emperor was a corpse god, unable to save his people, unwilling to release them from suffering. The Tau offered something better, something real. I watched the other refugees absorb it all, their faces slack with wonder or tight with suppressed doubt. Some wept with what seemed like relief. Others sat in stony silence, their hands moving in small gestures. I recognized prayers to him on terror, offered in secret defiance. Those people were gone within a week, taken away for additional counseling, and when I saw them again their eyes were empty. The food was nutritious and flavorless, precisely calibrated to our biological needs. Each meal came with supplements, small capsules that the auxiliaries told us would repair the damage done by years of malnutrition and industrial toxins. I swallowed them dutifully, feeling them dissolve in my stomach, wondering what else they might contain. The others ate gratefully, and I couldn't blame them. Many had been starving on our world, surviving on corpse starch and recycled protein paste mixed with chemical extenders. This food was clean, safe, sufficient. It kept us alive. That it had no taste, no character, no soul, well, that seemed a small price. I dreamed of my mother's cooking sometimes, the way she could make even synthetic gruel, edible with scavenged spices and herbs grown in hidden rooftop gardens. But those memories grew hazier with each passing day, like trying to recall a face seen through thick smoke. The psychological evaluations were constant. Every few days I would be called to a small room where a water-cast interviewer would ask me questions. They wanted to understand my background, my education, my beliefs, my fears. The interviewer was always patient, always calm, her voice never rising or falling beyond a narrow emotional range. She explained that this was necessary for proper integration, that the Tau could only help me if they understood me completely. "Tell me about your father," she said during one session, her large eyes unblinking. I told her he'd been a factory worker, that he'd died in an accident when machinery had failed. I didn't tell her about the commissar, about the bullet that had ended him for the crime of speaking about rebellion, about joining the Tau. She made notes on her data slate, the stylus moving in swift, precise gestures. "And your feelings about the Imperium?" she asked. I gave her the answers I thought she wanted. I told her about the poverty, the brutality, the endless grinding oppression. All of it was true. But I didn't tell her about the prayers my mother had taught me, about the faith that had sustained our family through generations of suffering. Some things, I learned, were too dangerous to speak aloud, even here in this supposed sanctuary. The training began after quarantine ended. We were divided into groups based on the aptitude tests we'd taken, cognitive assessments, physical evaluations, psychological profiles. I was placed in a technical track, deemed suitable for work with machinery and systems. They said I showed promise, that my mind was adaptable despite my limited education. 20 of us were assigned to a training facility in what they called a sept world, a planet fully integrated into the Tau Empire. The transport that carried us there was larger than the refugee vessel, more comfortable, with proper seats and viewing ports. Through the transparent sections I caught my first glimpse of a Tau city as we descended through the atmosphere. It sprawled across a coastal plain, its architecture a blend of curves and angles that seemed to flow naturally from the landscape. Towers rose in clusters, connected by elevated transit ways. The ocean beyond was actually blue, not the chemical gray I'd known all my life. I pressed my hand against the viewing port, feeling the slight vibration of the transport's engines, and for a moment I felt something dangerous stirring in my chest. Hope, perhaps, or its twisted sibling, despair dressed in hope's clothing. The training complex was efficient and sterile. We lived in dormitories, 30 to a room, sleeping on platforms that extruded from the walls. Everything was communal: the washing facilities, the dining area, the recreation spaces. Privacy was a concept that seemed not to exist here, or perhaps it was actively discouraged. The Tau trainers and their human auxiliary assistants moved among us constantly, observing, correcting, instructing. We learned the basics of Tau technology, starting with simple systems and gradually progressing to more complex machinery. The education was comprehensive and relentless. We studied for 8 hours, worked for 6 hours practicing what we'd learned, and spent 2 hours in physical conditioning. The remaining time was for eating, personal maintenance, and mandatory social integration sessions where we were encouraged to bond with our fellow trainees and embrace the principles of the greater good. The technology itself was seductive in its elegance. Where Imperial machinery was brutal and temperamental, requiring constant prayer and ritual to function, Tau systems simply worked. They were intuitive, designed with the user in mind, built to be maintained and repaired with minimal training. No machine spirits to appease, no sacred oils and incense, no benedictions and canticles, just clean engineering and logical principles. Part of me recoiled at this, the part that had been raised on stories of the machine god and the sacred nature of technology. But another part, the part that had watched my father die when a machine's temperamental spirit had turned violent, found it liberating. The instructor, a human auxiliary named Kovash, who'd been with the Tau for 15 years, demonstrated a pulse carbine's maintenance sequence. His hands moved with practiced ease, disassembling and reassembling the weapon in under a minute. "No mysteries," he said, his accent strange, caught between Imperial Gothic and Tau phonemes. "No secrets. The technology serves us, not the other way around. This is civilization. This is progress." I watched his fingers work, memorizing the sequence, and tried to ignore the voice in my head that whispered it was all blasphemy. The indoctrination was more subtle than I'd expected. They didn't rail against the Imperium constantly or force us to denounce our past beliefs. Instead, they simply presented alternatives, framed as rational choices. In history lessons, they showed us the timeline of human civilization, including the Age of Strife, the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy. But they told these stories differently. The Emperor wasn't a god but a warlord, powerful but flawed, who'd built an empire on conquest and oppression. The Imperium wasn't humanity's savior but its prison, keeping mankind trapped in superstition and ignorance. The Tau, by contrast, had evolved from primitive tribes to an interstellar civilization in mere thousands of years, guided by the principle of the greater good. They had no gods, no dogma, only practical philosophy and collective advancement. "See how much they'd achieved," the instructors would say, gesturing to hololithic displays of Tau worlds. "See what humanity could become if freed from the chains of false faith." Some of my fellow trainees nodded along enthusiastically. Others looked troubled but said nothing. I learned to keep my face neutral, my thoughts hidden, and I wondered if the emptiness I felt growing inside me was liberation or a different kind of death. The first time I truly understood what we'd become was 6 months into training. We were taken to observe a military exercise, fire warriors conducting drills in cooperation with human auxiliary units. The Tau moved with inhuman precision, their battlesuits flowing through combat patterns like dancers performing ancient choreography. But it was the human soldiers that made my chest tighten. They wore armor that was distinctly Tau in design, but modified for human physiology, blue-gray polymer plates over black bodysuits, helmets with integrated targeting systems. They carried pulse rifles and moved in formations that blended Imperial Guard tactics with Tau doctrine. Their skin tones varied: pale, dark, every shade between, but their faces all held the same expression: calm, focused, empty of doubt. They were efficient, effective, and utterly, completely, not Imperial. One of them, a woman with scarification patterns I recognized from my hive world, noticed me watching. She smiled, thin and cold, and I saw nothing behind her eyes that remembered what we'd been. She was Tau now, or as close to Tau as human flesh could manage. The greater good had consumed whatever she'd been before and remade her into a tool. A willing tool, perhaps, but a tool nonetheless. That night, I dreamed of my mother for the first time in weeks. She stood in the darkness of our old hab unit, her face illuminated by the weak glow of a single lumen strip. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged. She was trying to tell me something, warn me perhaps, but the words wouldn't come. I reached for her and she dissolved like smoke, and I woke gasping in the dormitory's recycled air. Around me, my fellow trainees slept peacefully, their breathing synchronized in a way that seemed unnatural. I lay still, counting the seconds between breaths, trying to remember the prayers my mother had taught me. But the words wouldn't form properly. They'd grown slippery in my memory, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I'd been here 6 months. Already I was forgetting. Already the person I'd been was becoming a ghost, fading in the bright, clinical light of Tau civilization. The second year was worse in ways I couldn't have anticipated. We'd progressed beyond basic training into specialized roles. I was assigned to a maintenance crew responsible for keeping the training complex's systems operational, power distribution, atmospheric processing, waste recycling, all the invisible infrastructure that kept the facility functioning. The work was demanding but not unpleasant. The technology was reliable, the procedures well documented, the equipment properly maintained. I worked alongside both humans and Tau, and gradually I began to understand their language, or at least the technical vocabulary necessary for my duties. The Tau I worked with were Earthcast primarily, engineers and technicians who viewed the universe through the lens of function and efficiency. They were patient instructors, never cruel, never dismissive. They treated me like a colleague, albeit a junior one, and that casual respect was more insidious than any amount of brutality would have been. It made me want to please them, want to prove myself worthy of their regard, want to become more like them. The cognitive dissonance was constant and exhausting. During my work shifts, I found satisfaction in a job well done, in systems running smoothly, in problems solved elegantly. I took pride in my growing competence, in the complexity of tasks I could now handle independently. The Tau noticed my progress and offered encouragement, their equivalent of approval. I was integrated, they said. Adapting well. A model of successful human-Tau cooperation. But in the dormitory at night, lying in the darkness among my sleeping peers, I felt something crumbling inside me. There were mandatory social sessions where we discussed our progress, our feelings, our commitment to the greater good. Facilitators, both Tau and human, guided these conversations, gently correcting any expressions of doubt or homesickness. They called it processing, working through the trauma of our former lives, but it felt like erasure. Each session peeled away another layer of who I'd been, replacing it with something cleaner, simpler, more aligned with Tau values. I participated fully because refusal meant additional counseling, and I'd seen where that led. Better to cooperate, better to adapt, better to survive. The treatment of those who couldn't adapt was never openly discussed. But we all knew. There was a medical facility on the complex's periphery, separate from the main training areas, where the troubled were sent for intensive therapy. They returned, changed, if they returned at all. Docile, compliant. Their speech patterns slightly altered, their memories of their past lives hazy and disconnected. Chemical reconditioning, I suspected, or neural intervention of some kind. The Tau had sophisticated medical technology, far beyond anything the Imperium could offer to common citizens like us. They used it, they claimed, only to help, only to heal damaged minds and restore balance. But I saw it for what it was, a tool of control, more sophisticated than the Commissar's bolt pistol, but no less final. The only difference was that the Tau's victims walked around afterward, functional and content, while Imperial justice left only corpses. I wasn't sure which was more merciful. In my third year I was assigned to a work detail that took me outside the training complex for the first time since arrival. We traveled to a nearby manufacturing center, a sprawling facility that produced components for Tau vehicles and equipment. The journey took us through a Tau city proper, and I pressed my face to the transport's viewing port, drinking in the sight of this alien civilization. The streets were clean and orderly, marked with clear signage in multiple languages. Tau of various castes moved purposefully through their daily routines, their movements efficient and unhurried. But there were humans too, walking among them, wearing modified versions of Tau clothing, speaking the language with varying degrees of fluency. Children played in designated recreation spaces, human children and Tau young together, their games a blend of cultures. It should have been beautiful, this vision of species cooperation. Instead it filled me with a grief I couldn't name. These humans belonged here in a way I never would. They'd been born into the Tauva, raised from infancy to accept their place in the greater good. They didn't remember the Imperium, didn't carry the weight of betrayal and loss. They were genuinely happy, or as close to happiness as human flesh could achieve in this ordered, purposeful existence. The manufacturing center reinforced everything the Tau had been teaching us. It was a monument to efficiency and cooperation. Humans and Tau worked side by side on assembly lines, each performing tasks suited to their particular physiology and aptitude. The Earth-caste engineers designed the components. Fire-caste quality inspectors ensured standards were met, and workers of both species assembled everything with practiced precision. The noise level was surprisingly moderate, despite the scale of production. Tau machinery operated with far less grinding and banging than Imperial factories. The air was clean, filtered, and recycled through advanced atmospheric systems. There were scheduled breaks, reasonable work shifts, safety protocols that were actually enforced. No one was beaten for working too slowly. No one collapsed from exhaustion or malnutrition. It was everything a factory should be, stripped of all the casual cruelty I'd witnessed in Imperial manufactorums. And yet watching the human workers move through their assigned tasks, I felt a profound wrongness that had nothing to do with working conditions. They were cogs in a machine, certainly, but so were all Imperial citizens. The difference was that these cogs believed the machine loved them, believed their labor had meaning beyond mere survival. And perhaps that belief made their enslavement complete in a way that simple oppression never could. My 4th year brought a significant change in my status. I was promoted to a supervisory role, overseeing a small team of newer trainees as they maintained the complex's systems. The promotion came with additional privileges, private quarters, expanded dietary options, access to recreational facilities normally reserved for long-term auxiliaries. I accepted it all because refusal would have marked me as problematic. But each privilege felt like another shackle. They were binding me to this life with comfort and responsibility, making the cost of descent higher with every passing month. My team consisted of 6 humans, all younger than me, all displaying the same eager compliance I'd learned to fake. They looked to me for guidance, called me senior with a respect I didn't deserve. I taught them what I knew about Tau technology, corrected their mistakes with the patience the Tau had shown me, and slowly became complicit in their transformation. I was no longer just a victim of the system. I was part of its machinery, helping to process new recruits, turning frightened refugees into functional components of the greater good. The worst part was that I was good at it. The Tau had been right about my aptitudes. I had a talent for understanding systems, for seeing how components interacted, for troubleshooting problems efficiently. In another life, perhaps, I could have served the machine god faithfully in some mechanicus workshop. Here I served the Tauva, and the difference seemed increasingly academic. The technology functioned regardless of which god or philosophy claimed to govern it. The systems I maintained kept hundreds of beings alive, human and Tau alike, by providing power, atmosphere, and sanitation. That utility, that purpose, was its own justification. The Tau had freed me from superstition, they would say, allowed me to see technology for what it truly was, engineering, not mysticism, and most days I believed them, because the alternative was admitting that I'd betrayed everything my parents died believing, and that was a truth I couldn't bear to face in the bright, clinical light of this sterile world. The crisis came in my 5th year, during what should have been a routine maintenance operation. We were upgrading power distribution nodes throughout the complex, replacing older components with improved models. I was working in a junction station deep in the facility's infrastructure, surrounded by the quiet hum of functioning systems. when I noticed something wrong with the neural interface ports on the new components. They were standard for Tau equipment connection points for users to interface directly with systems for diagnostic purposes. But these ports had additional architecture, subtle modifications I almost missed. When I queried the Earthcast supervisor about it, she explained with typical Tau directness. The modifications allowed for enhanced integration between user and system, she said. Improved efficiency through more direct neural feedback. It was optional currently, used mainly by specialist operators, but the long-term goal was universal implementation for all maintenance personnel. The technology would allow us to monitor and repair systems more intuitively, to understand the equipment at a nearly instinctual level. She made it sound beneficial, even inevitable, but I understood what she was really describing. They were going to wire us into their machines, make us literal extensions of their technology. Not servitors, the Tau considered that practice barbaric, but something perhaps more insidious. Willing cyborgs, convinced that surrendering more of our humanity was advancement rather than annihilation. I installed the components as instructed. I said nothing about my concerns because 5 years of integration had taught me the cost of dissent. But that night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my private quarters, a luxury that now felt like a cell, and stared at the ceiling while my mind raced. They were going to wire us into their machines, make us part of the infrastructure, and we would accept it because the alternative was being marked as maladjusted, sent for treatment, and returned as something hollow and compliant. The Imperium would have simply worked us until we died, but at least it wouldn't have pretended the work was for our own good. At least it wouldn't have asked us to believe that slavery was actually freedom, that losing ourselves was finding purpose. The Tau had perfected a more sophisticated form of oppression, one that made its victims grateful for their chains. And I was already wearing mine, had been fitted with them link by link over 5 years of careful conditioning. The recognition of this didn't free me. It only made the trap visible while leaving me too compromised to escape. The 6th year was when I finally saw another human from my original world, someone who'd escaped the Tau and lived among the Imperium. It happened during a supply run to a border station where multiple species conducted trade under carefully monitored conditions. I was part of a maintenance crew servicing the station's systems, working in restricted areas under Tau supervision. During a break I wandered into an observation area that overlooked the station's commercial sectors. Through the transparent barriers, I saw humans in tattered Imperial Guard uniforms being escorted by enforcers. They were prisoners, I realized, captured in some border skirmish and being transferred somewhere. One of them, a woman covered in scars and augmentics, looked up and made eye contact with me. Her eyes widened with recognition not of me personally, but of what I represented. She saw my Tau-modified clothing, my well-fed body, the data slate I carried. She saw a traitor. Her lips moved in what might have been a prayer or a curse. The guards pulled her away before I could read the full message. But I understood enough. To her, to the Imperium, to everything I'd once been, I was already dead, already damned. The fact that I walked and breathed and functioned made my betrayal worse, not better. I should have died loyal, she seemed to say. Should have accepted the Emperor's mercy rather than flee into alien hands. And standing there in my comfortable servitude, I couldn't argue with her assessment. That night I considered ending myself. The dormitory's medical kit contained supplies that could do the job quietly, without pain. I held a syringe of cleaning solvent and contemplated how much would be necessary to stop my heart. It would be easy. A small rebellion, a final refusal. But I couldn't do it. The conditioning, the integration, the sheer weight of survival instinct that had carried me through 5 years, it all held me back. I was too well adjusted, too thoroughly processed. The Tau had done their work efficiently. They'd given me just enough comfort, just enough purpose, just enough pride in my competence, that dying seemed wasteful rather than heroic. I put the syringe back and took a sedative from the medical kit instead, a pill designed to promote rest. It worked quickly, pulling me down into a dreamless sleep where neither the Emperor's judgment nor the greater good could find me. The 7th year was when they introduced the neural integration program formally. It was presented as a volunteer opportunity, a chance to advance within the auxiliary ranks, to become part of the cutting edge of human-Tau cooperation. The benefits were substantial: increased pay, better housing, priority access to medical care, accelerated career progression. The procedure was safe, they assured us, perfected over decades of research. Hundreds of humans had already undergone the process and reported enhanced capabilities and satisfaction with their work. They showed us testimonials, former maintenance techs and soldiers now seamlessly integrated with Tau systems, their eyes bright with fervor as they described the clarity and purpose they'd found. We were given informational materials to study, time to consider, encouragement but no pressure. The choice, they emphasized, was entirely ours. No one would be forced, no one would be punished for declining. It was a demonstration of Tau, respect for individual autonomy, a contrast to Imperial brutality. We could choose freely, they said, never acknowledging that they'd spent years ensuring we'd make the choice they wanted. I was among the first group called for selection interviews. The evaluator was a water-caste official I'd met before, her large eyes studying me with what might have been genuine concern. "You have served well," she told me. "Your skills are valuable, your loyalty proven. This is an opportunity to expand your capabilities, to achieve things no unaugmented human could accomplish. You would be among the pioneers of true integration." She showed me projections of my potential career path, with the augmentation oversight of critical infrastructure, positions of genuine authority, work alongside Earth-caste engineers as something approaching an equal. Without it, she implied, I would remain at my current level indefinitely, useful but limited, forever a junior partner in the greater good. The unspoken message was clear. Advancement required commitment. Commitment required sacrifice. This was the next test of my loyalty, more significant than any that had come before. I asked for time to consider. She granted it graciously, but I saw the evaluation being recorded on her data slate. Hesitation noted. Concern regarding full integration. Subject requires additional counseling. The counseling sessions began immediately. 3 times a week I met with a human therapist who'd undergone neural integration 5 years prior. She was patient and understanding, never pushing but always guiding. She explained her own journey, how frightened she'd been initially, how transformative the experience had proven. The integration hadn't diminished her humanity, she insisted. It had expanded it, given her capabilities and perspectives she'd never imagined. Yes, there were changes to how she perceived and processed information. Yes, some of her older memories had faded or reorganized. But those were acceptable losses compared to what she'd gained. She could interface with systems directly now, understand complex engineering problems intuitively, contribute meaningfully to projects that shaped multiple worlds. She had purpose. She had value. She had transcended the limitations of unmodified human flesh. And if occasionally she felt disconnected from her past, from the person she'd been before, well, that person had been broken anyway, traumatized by Imperial cruelty, and letting her go was liberation rather than loss. I listened to her words and saw the trap closing. The neural integration wasn't just augmentation. It was the final step of assimilation, the completion of the transformation they'd begun the day we fled our burning world. They would wire us into their machines, rewrite our neural architecture to think more like them, and we would lose whatever fragments of human identity we'd managed to preserve. We would become something hybrid, not quite Tau but no longer truly human, forever dependent on their technology and infrastructure. And we would thank them for it, because the alternative was acknowledging that we'd lost everything for nothing. The Imperium had promised us salvation through suffering, and we'd rejected it. The Tau promised salvation through integration, and we had nowhere else to run. I agreed to undergo the procedure because refusal would mark me as a failure, subject me to the kind of intensive therapy that destroyed whatever made someone themselves. At least this way I could pretend it was a choice. At least this way I could preserve the fiction of agency, as the last pieces of who I'd been were carefully, surgically removed. The preparation for neural integration took 3 months. They wanted to ensure I was physically and psychologically ready for the procedure, that my body would accept the implants without rejection, that my mind could adapt to the new ways of processing information. I underwent daily medical scans, cognitive assessments, neural mapping sessions. They measured my brain's activity while I performed various tasks, analyzed my thought patterns, identified optimal integration points. The Earthcast medical team explained everything in detail: where the implants would be placed, what functions they would enhance, how the interface with Tau systems would work. They showed me computer models of my brain with proposed augmentation sites marked in blue light. I watched my skull rotate in hololithic space, saw the precious meat of my mind reduced to diagrams and data points. They promised minimal invasiveness, rapid healing, carefully managed neuroplasticity. What they didn't mention was that once the implants were installed, removing them would cause catastrophic neural damage. The integration would be permanent, irreversible, a door closing forever on any possibility of return. The procedure itself was performed under local anesthesia. They wanted me conscious so they could monitor my responses in real time, ensure the implants were properly integrating with my existing neural architecture. I lay on a medical platform in an operating theater of blue-gray polymer and gleaming instruments, while Tau surgeons worked with precision that would make any Imperial chirurgeon weep with inadequacy. I felt pressure as they made incisions, heard the high-pitched whine of medical tools, smelled something like burned copper when they sealed the wounds. They'd shaved my head, marked the insertion points with luminous dye. Through the corner of my eye I could see monitors displaying my brain activity in real time, complex patterns of electrical and chemical signals rendered as cascading colors. "How do you feel?" the surgeon asked periodically, her voice filtered through a medical mask. "Fine," I told her. "No pain." It was true. There was no pain. Only a growing awareness of something foreign in my skull, circuits and processors, embedding themselves in tissue that had been purely organic for 26 years. They worked for 6 hours, placing 5 separate implant clusters, running tests after each placement, adjusting and calibrating until the readings satisfied them. The recovery took 2 weeks. They kept me in the medical facility, monitoring for any signs of rejection or adverse reaction. My head ached constantly, a deep throb that pain medications only partially masked. But worse than the physical discomfort was the awareness of the implant's presence. I could feel them in my thoughts, alien presences at the edges of my consciousness. Not controlling me, the technology wasn't designed for that, but present, nonetheless, observing, measuring, recording. At night I would lie awake, unable to sleep despite the medications, and sense the faint hum of active electronics inside my skull. The implants were powered by my body's own electrical field, drawing energy from my neurons firing. I was literally fueling my own transformation, my biology conscripted into powering its own obsolescence. The Tau medical staff assured me this was normal, that the sensation would fade as my brain adapted to the new neural architecture. They were right. By the end of the first week I barely noticed the implants anymore. My mind had accepted them, incorporated them into its map of self. I'd been modified and my consciousness had already adjusted, already forgotten what it felt like to be unaugmented. The speed of that acceptance terrified me more than the procedure itself. The training in how to use the neural interface lasted another month. They started me on simple tasks, direct querying of system diagnostics, basic command inputs without physical controls. I would focus on a piece of equipment and feel the implants activate, establishing connection through protocols I couldn't consciously perceive. Information would flow into my awareness, not as text or display, but as direct knowledge. I would simply know the system's status, understand its operational parameters, recognize any deviations from normal function. It was efficient and intuitive in ways that traditional interfaces could never match. But it was also violating. Each time I connected, I felt the system probing back, reading my thoughts, accessing my memories, analyzing my cognitive patterns. The connection was bidirectional. Yes, I could control and monitor Tau technology more effectively, but the technology could also read me, understand me, gradually reshape my thought patterns to align more closely with its own logical architecture. I was being debugged, my inefficient human cognition slowly optimized for better integration with machine systems. And I could feel it happening, could sense my thoughts becoming more ordered, more precise, less cluttered with emotion and intuition and all the messy elements that made consciousness human rather than computational. The first time I interfaced with a critical system, the main power distribution network for the entire complex, I finally understood what I'd become. The connection was overwhelming, a flood of data that should have been incomprehensible but somehow made perfect sense. I perceived the entire network simultaneously, thousands of components operating in synchronized harmony, energy flowing through circuits and conduits in patterns I understood with crystalline clarity. I saw inefficiencies, potential failure points, optimization opportunities. My consciousness expanded to fill the system, became distributed across its architecture. For those connected moments I wasn't a person occupying a body. I was the network itself, vast and complex and perfectly rational. And it felt right, felt natural, felt like coming home to a place I'd always belonged. When they disconnected me, I actually felt diminished, reduced, trapped in the small confines of mere flesh. The technician monitoring my session smiled with satisfaction at my readings. "Excellent integration," she announced. "You're adapting faster than most humans. The Earth caste will be pleased." I should have been horrified, should have recognized this as the final death of my humanity. Instead, I felt proud, eager to connect again, already addicted to the clarity and purpose I found in the machine. They'd won. I was theirs completely now, rewired to crave the very thing that was consuming my soul. The 8th year was when I stopped dreaming of my mother. The neural implants had done something to my sleep architecture, optimized my rest cycles for better performance. I still slept, still experienced REM activity, but my dreams became abstract and logical, data processing rather than emotional narrative. I would wake with my mind already organized for the day's tasks, my priorities clear and ranked by efficiency. The past receded further, became irrelevant to present function. I rarely thought about the hive world of my birth, the family I'd lost, the faith I'd abandoned. Those memories were still accessible if I deliberately recalled them, but they felt distant, like stories about someone else. The person I'd been was gone, dissolved gradually over 8 years of integration, and the person I'd become didn't mourn the loss. I worked more effectively now, interfaced seamlessly with Tau systems, contributed meaningfully to the complex's operation. I supervised teams of both augmented and unaugmented humans, managed critical infrastructure, solved problems with a clarity I'd never possessed before. By every objective measure, my life had improved dramatically since joining the Tau. I was healthier, better educated, more capable, more valued. I had purpose and security, and a clear path forward within the greater goods hierarchy. The cost was only myself. I was assigned to train new integrations, humans who'd volunteered or been selected for neural augmentation. I taught them what I'd learned, guided them through their first connections, helped their minds adapt to the new architecture. I was good at it, patient and understanding, remembering how frightening the process had been for me. But sometimes, watching their eyes widen during their first deep interface, seeing the moment when they stopped being purely human and became something else, I felt a ghost of emotion I couldn't quite name. Not regret, the implants made regret seem illogical. Not sorrow, the optimization had processed away that kind of unproductive sentiment. Something else. Some stubborn fragment of my original consciousness, recognizing kinship with these people in their final moments before transformation. I would dismiss the feeling, categorize it as residual neural noise from deprecated pathways, and continue the training session. But the feeling would return each time, persistent and inexplicable, a glitch in my otherwise efficient consciousness that even the Tau's sophisticated augmentation couldn't quite eliminate. In my 9th year, I was promoted to Senior Infrastructure Coordinator, overseeing not just maintenance but expansion of the complex's systems. It was a position of genuine authority, one that put me in regular contact with Earth-caste engineers and even occasional communication with Fire-caste commanders. I attended planning sessions where the Tau discussed long-term development strategies, expansion of human auxiliary programs, integration of new worlds into the Empire. They spoke freely in my presence, treating me as a trusted colleague rather than a subordinized species. The respect was real, I believe, or as real as such things could be between master and servant who'd forgotten they were a servant. I contributed ideas to system designs, offered insights based on human physiological requirements that the Tau might not consider. They listened, incorporated my suggestions when appropriate, thanked me for my valuable perspective. I was, by any reasonable standard, a success story. A human who'd not just survived contact with the Tau but thrived within their civilization. The propaganda videos would point to me as proof that integration works, that humans and Tau could truly cooperate for the greater good. Everything I'd become validated their entire philosophy. I was their triumph, and I couldn't even properly hate them for it. The crisis came in my 10th year. Though crisis might be too dramatic a word for what was really just the slow realization of an inevitable conclusion. I was overseeing installation of new systems in a freshly constructed wing when I had to interface deeply with the complex's primary network. It was routine work, calibrating connections and running diagnostic protocols. But this time, deep in the machine consciousness, I encountered something unexpected. Data fragments, old files that should have been purged long ago but had somehow survived in redundant storage. They were records from the complex's early days, when it had first started processing human refugees, casualty reports, termination authorizations, disposal protocols. The Tau had been far less careful then, before they'd refined their integration processes. Thousands had died or been destroyed, humans who couldn't adapt, couldn't accept the changes, couldn't be made to forget. The files were clinical, detailed, noting methods of termination with the same dispassionate precision they brought to all engineering problems. Chemical euthanasia, neural ablation, simple execution when other methods failed. The bodies had been recycled, their biological material repurposed for industrial applications. Nothing wasted. All very efficient. The greater good serving itself with the materials that no longer served it. I should have reported the files immediately. Should have flagged them for proper deletion. Instead, I absorbed their contents during that interface session. Let the data flow through my augmented consciousness, understanding with terrible clarity what the Tau had done, what they would still do, I realized, to anyone who threatened the careful stability of their integration programs. The comfortable fiction was that we'd chosen this life, volunteered for transformation, freely embraced the greater good. The truth was that we'd been given a choice between integration and death, and even integration came in stages, each one removing more of our original identity until nothing remained worth saving. I thought of all the people I'd trained, all the frightened humans I'd helped transform into efficient components of Tau civilization. I'd facilitated their destruction, made their surrender easier, been complicit in the annihilation of their humanity because my own humanity had already been too compromised to recognize what I was doing. The files showed me what I'd become, reflected my transformation in cold numerical data. Subject 4728 of Cohort 17. Integration successful, contributing to system efficiency within acceptable parameters. That was me. That was all I was now. A number, a data point, a successfully processed unit. I purged the files as protocol demanded, scrubbed them from the network with thoroughness that would satisfy any audit. But I couldn't purge them from my memory. Couldn't eliminate the knowledge they'd given me. The neural implants made it impossible to forget deliberately, to suppress information through simple willful ignorance. My augmented consciousness retained everything with perfect clarity, cross-referenced and catalogued for efficient recall. I walked through the following days in a strange fugue state, performing my duties automatically, while the implications echoed through my mind. The Tau medical staff noticed my distraction, flagged it in their constant monitoring of augmented personnel. I was called in for evaluation, questioned gently about any concerns or stresses. I told them nothing, blamed the distraction on complex system problems I was working through. They accepted this explanation, updated my file, adjusted my medication cocktail slightly to improve focus. The session ended with reassurances about my valuable service and reminders about mental health resources available to all auxiliaries. They were genuinely caring, genuinely concerned, genuinely convinced they were helping me. That somehow made it all worse. The final transformation came not with drama, but with quiet resignation. I realized, interfacing with systems one day, that I no longer wanted to resist. The knowledge of what had been done to me, what I'd become, what I'd helped do to others, it all seemed remote, intellectually interesting, but emotionally irrelevant. The implants had done their work too well. My capacity for genuine rebellion had been optimized away, replaced by efficiency protocols and integration directives. I could recognize my own annihilation, but couldn't feel appropriately horrified by it. The best I could manage was a kind of distant melancholy, like mourning for someone I'd once known but could barely remember. My mother's face was a blur in memory, my father's voice lost entirely. The prayers I'd learned as a child were just phonemes, words without meaning. The Emperor was a concept I understood intellectually, but couldn't worship, couldn't even properly reject. I was empty of everything except function, purpose without passion, competence without soul. The greater good had consumed me completely, and left nothing behind that could object to being consumed. I write this now in the facility's data logs, hidden in redundant systems where it might survive deletion protocols. Not as confession. Confession implies regret I can no longer properly feel, not as warning. Anyone who might read this would already be too integrated to heed warnings. Perhaps simply as testimony, a record that someone noticed their own erasure, even if they couldn't prevent it. The Tau will find these words eventually. Their monitoring systems are too thorough to miss deviant data for long. They'll delete the files, adjust my neural architecture to prevent future ideation along these lines, and I'll return to my duties without this troublesome awareness. I'll continue serving the greater good, training new integrations, maintaining the systems that keep this vast machinery of assimilation functioning smoothly. I'll be content, even happy, in the limited way my optimized consciousness experiences happiness. I'll live for decades more, useful and efficient, and thoroughly domesticated, and when I finally die, they'll harvest my implants for reuse, recycle my biological components for industrial applications, and update their records to reflect successful integration lifecycle completion. Subject 4728. Final disposition. Resources fully utilized for collective benefit. The greater good, continuing as it always does, efficient and inevitable, and utterly inhuman despite wearing human faces. This is what it means to join the Tau. Not dramatic corruption like the whispered horrors of chaos, not brutal servitude like the Imperium's endless grinding oppression. Something more subtle and complete, the slow dissolution of self into collective, identity into function, humanity into tool. They give you everything you need, except permission to be yourself. They treat you with respect while erasing everything that makes you worthy of respect. They offer you a better life at the cost of your capacity to value what better might mean. And the worst part, the truly unforgivable part, is that it works. You become grateful for your chains because they've rewired your brain to categorize chains as freedom. You embrace your annihilation because you've lost the ability to distinguish annihilation from transcendence. The Imperium would have let me die human. Damned, perhaps, but authentic in my damnation. The Tau have made me live as something else entirely, comfortable and useful, and utterly, irreparably lost. If I had a soul left to sell, this would be where I'd admit it was already spent, traded piece by piece for comfort and purpose, and the seductive lie that any of it mattered. But I don't. The greater good has it now. Optimized, integrated, gone.